I'm going to be talking to Jonathan Arnold, a senior research associate for the Canadian Climate Institute, about a new study called Net Zero Opportunities, a province by province comparison. And in this interview, we're going to discuss transition opportunities and risk for Alberta. So welcome to the interview, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, I'm really excited to talk about Alberta because I've been covering Alberta. Well, we started in almost 15 years ago on online journalism in Calgary in 2008 and covering a lot of the energy industry since. And my take on this is that Alberta has, of all the provinces, the most energy transition related risk, but it also has a tremendous amount of opportunity. Is that a fair summary?
I think it is a fair summary. I think when we think about risk, I think that the flip side of that is often opportunity as well. It just depends on how that is managed. And as you say, Alberta is one of the provinces with the most transition risk, highest vulnerability. About 9% of its entire workforce is in vulnerable sectors, and that's primarily oil and gas. So that's a big chunk. That percentage increases even more when you start looking at a local level in places like Fort Mac. That percentage is in the 20s and sometimes even 30s. So I think that's really important to consider. But as you say, the flip side of that is that there's tremendous opportunity in Alberta, and that's what we're trying to show in our latest research to shine a light on some of that, because I think it's often an area that's either forgotten or not looked at as seriously.
Right. And if we're going to discuss risk in Alberta, there are a couple of really key risks. Now, I don't know if your report addressed this, but the perception of the energy transition by leaders within Alberta, and I'm talking about political leaders, business leaders, and in particular, oil and gas industry leaders, their perception is that the energy transition is kind of just getting started and we've got lots of time, and there'll be plenty of demand for oil in particular, into the 2040s and 2050s. Don't worry about it. And the reality, I think, when you get outside Canada, is the transition is moving much more quickly. And so the political leadership or the leadership around this hasn't kept up, and policy hasn't kept up as a result.
So our research before this, the Sink or Swim report that we released in the fall, looked at exactly that question. And what we found is when you consider the pledges internationally at a policy level, so about 90% of the world's GDP is represented by a commitment to net zero by mid-century. When you consider how fast capital markets are moving, and this is accelerating at a pace that I don't think anyone has seen just even in the past few years, and then the technological progress in terms of technologies just getting cheaper and easier and easier to help in the transition. So when you combine all of those things, there's lots of reasons to believe that it is happening more quickly than what some believe in parts of Canada. And I think we need to take that very seriously when you consider how exposed our country is as a whole and how exposed Alberta is as a province. I think it is very incumbent on governments and business leaders and communities to think about this as something that is going to pick up speed if we are serious about reaching our international climate targets.
I don't want to belabor this, but there's some data that I think viewers need to know. So the demand for oil is about 60-70% of it is transportation, about 50% is ground transportation, so vehicles, gasoline, diesel. And so basically the automakers are the market for Alberta oil. They determine which fuel gets used in vehicles. And between now and 2026, just the big automakers, not in China or India or the smaller ones like Volvo, but just the big ones have committed $341 billion of capital to switching over to electric. That's astounding. And that speaks, as Nat Bullard at Bloomberg NEF says, CapEx is destiny. And I think that is a point that is too often ignored in Alberta. But in your report, you talk about other risks, and in particular, the United States is changing its policies, changing its approach to this, And that is where we send all of our oil and gas exports. So that represents a significant risk.
Yeah, and we point that out in the Sink or Swim report, and we talk about it in the latest research that we put out. And yeah, part of it is, as you say, the shift to EVs or zero emissions vehicles is going to have a profound impact on the future demand for oil. And what we really are looking at here is not just policy. I mean, there's obviously lots of things that the U.S. government could do in the next few years that could be quite significant. But I think you also have to just go back to the other factors too, in terms of technological change. People are buying EVs just because they are a better product in many ways, aside from emissions. And same thing with capital markets. So I think that when you combine all of those factors, I think that we really need to treat this as something that could move a lot faster and cause a lot more disruption if it does move fast and we're not ready for it.
Now, there are plenty of transition-related opportunities, and that's something that we spend a lot of time talking about risks for Alberta, but Alberta has plenty of opportunity here for low carbon fuels and all, clean electricity and all sorts of technologies and other opportunities. But and this is actually in a way a risk as well, Jonathan. Your report noticed that there's 130 companies active in attracting investment in various transition opportunity markets, but most of them are located in Calgary and Edmonton. Whereas the oil and gas industry, there are in places like Devon and Wainwright and Medicine Hat and Tabor, and there are all sorts of bases there for drilling companies and employees. And it may be that the opportunities are in the cities and less in the rural and small towns, small cities. And that's, on one hand, a big opportunity. On the other hand, quite a significant risk.
I think there's a little bit more to it than that we need to, a little bit more nuance, I should say, in that, yes, the jobs that we're seeing, or the companies are headquartered predominantly in urban centers. And this is something that's not unique to Alberta. It's something that we see in every province, basically, except for Ontario and Quebec. So it's not just Alberta specific, but it's also, it's not the best indicator of where economic activity is happening. Yes, having a company headquartered in a community or city is important for jobs and investment, but it's not the only indicator or the sole indicator for where economic activity and investment is taking place. So there are opportunities for companies to be headquartered in Calgary or Edmonton and still provide lots of job opportunities in the more remote or rural areas. I think it's still something that we need to be very, very cognizant about, as policymakers in Alberta start putting policies together to address the transition. I think that, yeah, the idea is to stimulate growth and jobs across the province, particularly in those communities that see that high vulnerability currently.
Now, so some of the sectors where there are opportunities, you've got industrial transition, 29%, low carbon electricity, 21% of the opportunities, agriculture, technology, and alternative proteins, 20%. Tell us a little bit more about those.
Yeah, so that's the breakdown of the number of companies. So as you say, 130 in Alberta in total, and these are what we call Pureplay companies. So these are companies that exclusively work in these transition opportunity markets, and so there are 10 of them in total that we highlight in the research. As you say, things like clean hydrogen, low carbon electricity, low carbon transportation. So it doesn't incorporate those big, large multinationals that may have operations in some of those areas, but our methodology allows us to pinpoint the companies that are exclusively working in these spaces. And as you say, Alberta stands out amongst the other provinces for having a high percentage of its companies in this industrial transition bucket. And you can think of this as companies that are helping large multinationals decarbonize. So a company that helps monitor and reduce methane emission leaks from an oil and gas company, for example, would be included in that industrial transition bucket, but it is not in an oil and gas company per se. So there's lots of activity happening in Alberta in that industrial transition bucket. The other really big thing that stood out in our research in Alberta is just the activity taking place in the low carbon electricity market. If you look at the top 6 companies in Alberta in our list of 130, in terms of the amount of investment capital that they've raised over the last 10 years, of the top 6, 5 are in the low carbon electricity market. So that this is where the money is really being invested in Alberta in absolute terms, and it's really, I think, a good lesson or insight for other provinces to see in Canada too, just in terms of the unique way that Alberta manages its electricity grid. I think that there's tremendous opportunity there, and that's where you're seeing a lot of the big investments being made by big corporates and from finance more generally.
Yeah, that jives with what I'm being told by fund managers and money managers that I talk to, is that in Alberta, there is lots of money looking for opportunities to invest in clean tech, those sorts of industries. But let's talk about some of the barriers to capturing these opportunities. And the big one that comes to mind is policy. And yours is not the first report to note this. I mean, there was a report just last fall that came out from the Calgary Economic Development that noted that policy was a big barrier. And other reports have noticed that. And everywhere, often when I talk to experts, we talk about this. They say, look, policy investors need stability. They need, to know what the future, what's coming in the future. And if you don't have a stable climate policy, energy policy, then that makes them nervous and it makes capital more difficult to attract. And Alberta is being criticized for its lack of policy.
Yeah, I think that in Alberta, it really does stand out. There are a few areas where I think some pretty significant gains could be made with fairly, I shouldn't say marginal policies, but in terms of just getting up to where other provinces like BC and Quebec already are. Things like zero emissions vehicle standards, or just really stepping up the building codes to reflect goals of net zero by mid-century. Like those 2 things alone could really drive a lot of, not only a lot of emissions reductions, but just a lot more demand certainty for the companies that are operating in this space. And that's what companies are really looking for. And that's why we've seen the success in BC and Quebec for exactly that reason. So I think it's still very noteworthy that Alberta has made the progress that it has, despite kind of the uncertainty in the last 5 to 6 years. We've seen a few big policy reversals that kind of mess with that certainty piece for businesses and investors. So I think it is still impressive in terms of the growth that has been made, or the progress that has been made. But there's lots more that can be done, and it really does come down to giving companies and businesses the certainty that they need to make big transformative investments.
Yeah, and I think we should be fair to the UCP government of Jason Kenney, is that there have been some progress made in certain areas. Like, for instance, the geothermal policy framework has been announced. There's a hydrogen strategy. There's no roadmap or policy yet, but presumably that's coming. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage. There's been a promise that the policy it's in development. So it's not like there hasn't been any. It's just that it's been a very kind of hodgepodge kind of approach to it, and there's no clear overall direction on where the government's going on carbon pricing and climate policy in general. I think that's the criticism here. It's not that they haven't done anything. So let's talk about the another policy related issue, and that's wildcard technologies versus safe bets, because Alberta seems to love its wildcards.
Yeah, and just one last thing on the last point there. I think that there's a lot of interest and commitment in the private sector, and acknowledgement of the transition, and perhaps at times more so than at the government level. And I think we're starting to see that in massive investments being made in things like net zero chemicals, for example, in Alberta, and the push to blue hydrogen. So yeah, I think there's lots more that can be done on the policy front to stimulate more growth on the wildcard technology side. As you say, the Alberta government has a hydrogen strategy, and I think that taking that out a step further into policy development will be really important. It's obviously a technology that exists and is well I shouldn't say commercialized, but certainly further along than many others. And I think there's lots of opportunities to scale that up I think it may require some more specific targeted investments, and that could include R&D, that could include tax credits for certain types of activities, but also just that broader piece of just having an enabling environment with policy certainty moving forward.
Right. And so wildcard technologies are those that are show promise. Carbon capture and storage is maybe not the best example. It's been around for a while and is fairly well understood. But green hydrogen, small modular reactors, there's a good example of a wildcard technology. One, it's not going to be here till the 2030s at the earliest, but we need to keep investing in it. And over again, the Alberta government keeps emphasizing, puts a lot of effort into like small modular reactors, while ignoring the fact that it has the best wind and solar resources in the country, and it has a deregulated electricity market where wind farms and solar farms can be built and then can get onto the grid, plug into the grid fairly easy. That seems to be just a missed opportunity.
Yeah, and we point this out in the snapshot that we did for Alberta, in that the oil and gas sector is still a very dominant player in the province, and I think distracts from the areas of future growth. So I think that there's lots of work being done to help reduce emissions in the existing sources of growth in Alberta, and that would include decarbonizing oil and gas so that it stays competitive as a global price on carbon increases. But there's a whole lot more that can be done in the province on really establishing those future sources of growth. And you named a few of them. And I would even, hydrogen and CCUS, I mean, yes, those technologies have been around for a long time, but we're talking about, getting these up to scale and commercializing them so that they're cost competitive and options that are feasible in the transition. So I think that there's lots more that can be done there as well.
Right. So let's talk about workers, because this is on the mind. I know we have a lot of energy media readers in Alberta. We interview experts from there all the time, and there's a fair amount of anxiety about employment as the transition accelerates, and maybe we see the decline of some demand for oil and gas. Well, what are we going to do? And the common comment is, well, I'm an electrician making $150,000 a year at the oil sands in Fort Mac. I can't go down and support my family making $65,000 putting solar panels on people's roofs. And that there seems to be I don't know, not a lot of clarity on how the workforce, the energy workforce, is going to be transitioned over from the hydrocarbon sector over to some other kind of clean energy.
Yeah, I think that unfortunately that example of an oil worker taking a job as a manufacturer or an installer of solar, for example, I think it's just an oversimplification of the options that exist or could exist. And so I think there are lots of skills and trades and expertise that could be transferred over to new opportunities, geothermal being one of them. I think it really comes down to governments looking at this as a long-term transition for their workforce and identifying the future sources of vulnerability and the future sources of opportunity, and then just gearing the education system and the training system, getting everyone on board in terms of the companies, the unions, the communities, and the local governments, Indigenous governments, and driving towards that to smooth that transition. I think right now people are working with an insufficient amount of information, and that I think leads to those jumps in logic from like, well, if I can't be an oil and gas worker, then I'm going to be making $60,000 doing something else. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that it really comes down to exploring the pathways of transformation of the oil and gas sector in Alberta, and I don't think we've done that. And I think that needs to be done at the local level.
Right. I would agree with that. And it's almost like the government is afraid to talk about the energy transition because then it'll make its allies angry, and so they avoid the messaging entirely. Or so what if we had to wrap all this up, Jonathan, what is it that the Alberta government needs to do? I mean, there's been talk about we need an energy transition plan. We need a climate plan and policy around that. Is that the kind of direction it needs to go?
I think we need to think about this in the long term and in terms of future proofing Alberta's economy or Canada's economy, and really taking that seriously, and the pace and scale of the global transition and how Canada is going to fit in that. At the end of the day, we're ultimately talking about the livelihoods and jobs and the health of communities across Canada, particularly in Alberta, that are currently in more vulnerable sectors. And we need to recognize that this is a huge deal, and this will have implications for generations to come. And I think when we start thinking about it in that long-term perspective, it takes some of those more sensitive aspects of it out, and maybe it will allow us to focus on those longer-term goals, and may help get people on board. But I think we need to also listen, because these are the jobs and livelihoods of people, and it makes sense why this may feel threatening to their current livelihoods.
Jonathan, always appreciate it. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.